1/4 of the world's population, a bigger enterprising people, the world's largest army, nuclear weapons under active development, a revolutionary ideology determined to change the face of the earth. These are the basic facts about China, the greatest unknown in the struggle for peace. The struggle for peace, the rise of China. No one knows how great a threat to world order the Chinese are now or will be in the future. Even the Chinese leaders themselves cannot have any assurance about when or how they will use their army. But governments throughout the world must decide what they will have to face from China and her leaders. For Asian powers, India, Japan, even Australia, China's future is a decisive part of their future. For the major powers, the present optimistic hopes for world security depend on what is done by the rulers of Peking. Conclusions can only be drawn from the facts about what the Chinese could do and from the evidence over the years of what they have done. China, like the Soviet Union, is a continental power. Her army, with 2.25 million men, is the largest anywhere and the predominant force in Asia. Having relied on others until 1960, the Chinese are now dependent on their own industry for weapon production. They can produce all the basic light arms their army needs and are now turning out one of the best Russian medium tanks. The Air Force, too, is based on Russian types assembled in Chinese plants. While the Russians were cooperating, about 2,000 MiG fighters were built and perhaps 300 light bombers. But no one is quite sure how many are still fully serviceable. Nuclear weapons have become a high priority of the Chinese military effort. Their first nuclear explosion was in 1964, 12 years after the British and 4 years after the French. But the Chinese surprised the world by building the most technically difficult and expensive facility, a gaseous diffusion plant. They are obviously going as fast as possible for hydrogen bombs. They are also developing ballistic missiles like America's rockets to carry them. This is a long-term effort, according to a close student of Chinese policy, Morton Halperin.
The Peking leadership, I think, takes a very long view of historical developments, and that they see China becoming a great power at the level of the United States and the Soviet Union, perhaps in 20 or 30 years. And they clearly see a major nuclear force as part of this situation.
The editor of the China Quarterly, Roderick McFarker, thinks they will go for long-range weapons as fast as possible.
In my opinion, the Chinese aim in developing hydrogen weapons and a nuclear armory in general is to attain parity with the Soviet Union and the United States in terms of world power and more precisely in terms of military power. Therefore, I take it as an assumption that they are putting all the money and men and expertise they can afford into developing H-bombs and into developing delivery systems, because they cannot claim parity with the two superpowers until they're able to land their H-bombs on American and Soviet targets. Now, the precise date when they will be able to achieve that aim is uncertain. I would thought it would be somewhere in the mid-70s or late 70s.
But there are wide differences about just how powerful China is now. Opinion in the United States, in India, and in Australia is generally inclined to say that she threatens world peace. Europeans and Japanese tend to put the emphasis on the limits of Chinese power, especially while she is isolated and without major allies. Some of the weaknesses in the present Chinese armed forces are emphasized by the president of America's Rand Corporation, Henry Rowan.
Well, China, in some ways, looks very impressive. There's certainly a lot of people there. China's army is very big, an enormous army. But China has really very severe limitations. It has a very limited industrial base. It has very poor means of transportation. It has tough logistics problems. That very big army has trouble being moved anywhere in large quantities. China's naval power is very limited. Its ability to move troops across frontiers is limited very much by the fact that in most of the directions it might move in, the communications are very, very poor indeed. So that in conventional terms, China is not an enormous threat. I don't mean to suggest it's negligible. It's just not as impressive when one looks at it from the point of view of where force can actually be moved and applied as it does on paper.
The military power of Communist China has been tested in several conflicts. Her longest-standing conflict is with the Chinese nationalists on Formosa or Taiwan and the islands of Matsu and Quemoy. For the Communist Chinese, this is the unresolved part of the Civil War. It is unresolved because America's 7th Fleet stopped the Communist Chinese army from crossing the Formosa Strait. On Formosa, the old ruler of China, Chiang Kai-shek, still speaks for all China in the United Nations and maintains his aging army for a fading day of liberation. His army cannot compete on the mainland, and Mao Zedong's army cannot reach the island. Communist China's biggest war also brought her up against American power. This was the war in Korea in the early 1950s, which ended with a truce on the original line between North and South Korea, the 38th parallel. The Korean War had been started by the North Koreans under Russian, not Chinese, influence. Without warning, the North Koreans had driven into South Korea, and only the availability of large American forces in Japan had saved South Korea from being overwhelmed. A great Allied army, mainly American, then drove the North Koreans right back up the peninsula. It was at that stage that the Chinese army was thrown into the war, and the outside world could judge its worth.
Once the Chinese got into the Korean War, they proved in the first instance extremely effective. Their human wave tactics, in which they were prepared to accept the loss of great numbers of men, quite startled Western forces, I think it's fair to say, initially. And as one knows, they pushed the Western armies right back down the Korean peninsula. What I think happened in the end was that the Chinese found that once the West, and in particular America, got going, their human wave tactics were not good enough against the most powerful modern weapons. And that I think it's noticeable that the Chinese were quite eager to call a truce eventually as they were being pushed back up the Korean peninsula.
To the south, China has had more success. She has annexed Tibet, and in a short war she drove the Indians from disputed border territory. The Tibet campaign in 1951 was, to the Chinese communists, a part of their effort to get control of the whole country. They met with little resistance from the old Tibetan order. The historic independence of the area within China was ended. When in 1959 the people rose in revolt, large numbers of troops were moved in, and it was ruthlessly suppressed. Peking also wanted to control the communications into Tibet. Some of the communications lay across territory claimed by India. So, in October 1962, while Soviet missiles were being installed in Cuba, Chinese troops crossed the Indian frontier. Their advance brought fears that they might occupy the rich province of Assam, but they soon fell back, occupying the land only up to what they claimed was the frontier. But with the problem of bringing their supplies across the Himalayas, it is doubtful whether they could have sustained their advance against strong opposition. This is the view of Major General Som Dutt of the Indian Army.
In 1962, the Chinese did put in a sizable effort against our forces. We were perhaps not as prepared for it as we might have been, and certainly they succeeded much more than they had possibly hoped for. It was not easy to stem the advance. Equally, I think that the reason why they went back after the success that they attained was primarily because it was not really possible to sustain a large-scale operation across the Himalayas unless you have got a logistic backing, a really worthwhile backing behind you. And I think the reason why they retreated, apart from what they said, was because of the lack of such a backing.
But although the lack of backing stopped the Chinese army pushing on into India, Peking had apparently achieved the planned objectives. Morton Halperin.
Chinese had two basic objectives in the invasion of India in 1962. First, to seize the strategic road into Tibet, which they have done and still hold. Second, I think they wanted to humiliate the Indians to demonstrate that India was not a major power. I think they have achieved these objectives, and I think they're unlikely to engage in military force against India again.
China has good relations with India's neighbor Pakistan and has made a generous border settlement. But where China and Russia share a common border, the Chinese still claim territory, though they have not chosen to provoke a conflict. Pakistan is the leading Muslim power in the area, and there are millions of Muslim tribesmen under Russian rule in Central Asia. The Chinese are more interested in gaining the allegiance of these peoples than in getting into a war with the Soviet Union. Roderick McParker.
Now, I don't think that the Chinese have any intention of challenging this border by military force, just as they have no intention of challenging the United States by military force. The Chinese are quite well aware that the Soviet Union is far more powerful than they are, and that there would be no point in really attempting to readjust small areas of the border by force, which could only result in a war, which in turn would only result in devastation of China and get her nowhere.
But apart from the conflicts on her borders, China is involved in Southeast Asia, where she has different motives and a different role as the sponsor of subversive communist movements, particularly a decade ago in Malaya and now in Vietnam. This for China is the strategy for world communist victory. The Chinese communist leader Mao Zedong has laid it down that the way to victory is to capture the countryside and gradually use the villages to surround the towns. And Lin Piao, the man whom many think is now marked out to succeed Mao Zedong, has said that this is a doctrine for world revolution as well. The poor countries, the villages of the world, must gradually be captured and used to surround the towns, the rich countries of Europe and North America. Throughout Southeast Asia, the Chinese have been giving communist insurgents strong support in capturing the countryside. The question is how effective the Chinese can be in achieving these objectives in foreign countries of which they have little experience. What the world knows for certain is that China is enormous, that she has had steady but not spectacular economic growth, that there is a strong drive towards nuclear weapons, that she is isolated by a policy of hostility to all the major powers, and that Russia and India, which thought of China as a close friend, have been bitterly rebuffed. Vast and isolated, China seems to present three different kinds of threat, all of which must be assessed. There is China, the great nuclear power of the future, China, the conventional threat to Asia, and China, the sponsor of subversion. And the outstanding case of subversion today is the war in Vietnam, close to China's border. But will Peking be drawn into an operation like this?
The Chinese are extremely unlikely to intervene in Vietnam because what they believe is being proved in Vietnam is the success of Mao's theory of national liberation struggle. The Chinese believe and hope that the Viet Cong, supported by the North Vietnamese, will defeat even the massive forces of the United States and thus prove that a national liberation struggle can win anywhere in the world, no matter what the United States tries to do to stop it. This being the case, they believe this will give a tremendous impetus to this kind of revolutionary fervor elsewhere in the underdeveloped world. Now, if the China were to intervene, it would immediately prove that this theory was bankrupt, because the mere fact of Chinese intervention in an attempt to pull the irons out of the fire for the Vietnamese would show that the Vietnamese were not able to run a national liberation struggle by themselves.
In the United States, the need to contain China is generally accepted, but there is a major debate about the right way to do it. Critics of the administration increasingly doubt whether fighting North Vietnam helped to contain China. Senator Frank Church.
The containment of China is a proper objective of American policy. It is not with that objective, but rather with the means that have been employed in the name of that objective that I have criticized American policy in Southeast Asia. You do not contain China by fighting North Vietnam. Indeed, a stable North Vietnam, whatever its ideological complexion, is one of the most useful bricks in the wall that could contain China.
Vietnam is a war of sophisticated weapons against communist subversion. Will the Chinese sponsor subversions like this throughout Southeast Asia? British Defense Secretary Dennis Healey.
I think very often we in the West tend to misread history as a tendency to say, well, the communists took control of the whole of Eastern Europe after the war by subversion. Of course, this isn't the case. The Red Army occupied the whole of Eastern Europe after the war and put the communists in power, which was quite a different thing. And the actual Chinese capability to control events in other countries in Southeast Asia is very limited. There came a great cropper recently, for example, in Indonesia, where they were totally impotent once the internal balance of power in Indonesia switched against the communists. Where I think they will retain an important power to do mischief is among the overseas Chinese communities in, for example, Sarawak and other parts of Southeast Asia. But I think it is possible to exaggerate, first of all, the Chinese will to war, which I think is very limited, and secondly, their power to create trouble entirely on their own.
What then do the Chinese see as the future role for their army, the largest army in the world? Is it designed to achieve dominance in Asia or even beyond? The Chinese armed forces, like those of any country, reflect the fears and ambitions of those who have designed them. And some who have looked at them carefully think that they are primarily designed to stop an American invasion of China itself.
The major war that the Chinese are planning to fight is a war which involves an American invasion of China. That this is the war that poses the greatest threat to China, the war that they consider the most likely. So that the strategy remains very much one of people's war, as originally laid down by Mao and as implemented during the Chinese Civil War. That is to say, the main function of the military force is to be ready to deal with an American land invasion. The basic Chinese strategy is to rely primarily for this purpose on the militia, which involves a very large percentage of the population. The notion being that the militia would engage in guerrilla warfare against the invading American forces, and that the main army would fall back into the mountains, try to maintain the revolution, at least in part of China.
The sheer size of the Chinese army makes it an important factor in the calculations of all major powers. But whether it will build up into a real threat is doubted by British Defense Secretary Dennis Healey.
I think you have to draw a distinction here between the physical military capability which the Chinese could produce if they wanted to, which would be very, very formidable indeed, certainly by the end of the 1970s, and the question of whether they're likely to use, first of all, to produce that capability, and secondly, if they produce it, to use it for conventional aggression against their neighbors. By conventional aggression, I mean sending troops or aircraft across frontiers to inflict casualties on a different state. My personal feeling, though I think it's important to stress that nobody can feel any certainty about his instincts here, is that so long as there are countervailing military capabilities in the world, and here I think the Russian capability may be as important in the Chinese mind as the American or British capability, the Chinese are not likely deliberately to produce a situation which leads to war with major powers.
A similar view of what Mao Zedong plans to do with his army is taken by the leader of one independent Asian country, Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew.
Beyond the frontiers of China, I think they are not anxious to send in their soldiers to occupy these territories, but they are communists. They are Chinese. They would therefore like to see, first, more communist regimes emerge, and second, being Chinese, these communist regimes must recognize the preeminence of the Chinese Revolution and the fact that here is the central power in the world.
But India, like the United States, wants strong defenses to help stabilize the area to the south of China. Sisir Gupta of the Indian Council of World Affairs.
If we can have a degree of military strength which makes it impossible for China to make moves in that area, that itself is a big contribution to Asian stability. Because the far eastern region is already stable to a great extent, South Korea and Japan. It's Southeast Asia which is the immediate problem, and South Asia, India and Pakistan. And I think if India can perform this very limited role of containing China in the south, that itself is a big contribution to make to Asian stability.
There remains the long-term problem of accommodating China as a nuclear power and the effect this will have on our Asian neighbors. Although her industrial development has a long way to go, it is certain that she will acquire a nuclear force and that some delivery means will be developed. In the first phase, her weapons are likely to have enough range for Asian targets. In the second phase, they are likely to be able to hit North America and Europe. But even in the first phase, the major governments will have to give serious consideration to China's nuclear power.
I think the live issue, which I think is still probably being debated in Peking, is does one need a nuclear capability which can destroy American cities in order to deter an American nuclear attack against China? And I think it's uncertain. Chinese, I think, no longer fear that the United States might wake up one morning and decide to destroy China. They believe now that if an American nuclear attack against China does occur, it will be because of something going on around the borders of China. A war in the Taiwan Straits, a war in Vietnam, a war in India, or something of the sort. I think they may believe that they get a substantial amount of deterrence of the United States by an ability to destroy Asian cities, by the ability to destroy Tokyo, to destroy New Delhi, and so on. And I think for a very long time, the Chinese may rely on this ability to destroy Asian cities to deter the United States, in the same way that the Soviet Union has for a very long time relied on the ability to destroy European cities as the way to deter the United States. Now, I think at some point Peking will want an intercontinental capability, and the estimates are that they could have one in terms of their capability as early as 1975. But I think it's uncertain, even in Peking, whether they will get it that quickly. My own guess would be that it will probably take longer than that, perhaps another 10 years, before they begin to develop intercontinental capability.
However long it takes them, the Chinese are laying the foundations of a technically minded modern nation. The objective is clear. It is nothing less than to make China once again the central power in the world.
I think Mao would like to see China as one of the superpowers of the world, the equal of the United States and the Soviet Union. Perhaps eventually he imagines the superpower, even above those two. Now, this is clearly a long-term process, but everything that they do and everything they say gives me the impression that this is firmly his conviction. Traditionally, the Chinese have always seen themselves as the center of the civilized world, and Mao, who grew up in the traditional culture, I think sees this picture transmitted now to the world stage, in which China one day will again be the center of the civilized world.
The world cannot have a grand strategy for dealing with China. For Russia, there is great uncertainty about the impact of China on the world communist movement. For America, there is no assurance about where her deep involvement in Asia will lead her. Can Peking be persuaded to live as part of a world order? One man who played an important part in defeating a communist insurgency is former Malayan Minister of Defense, Sir Robert Thompson.
The West strategy, in order to contain China's global strategy, should, I think, be twofold. First, we've got to find the answer to these people's revolutionary wars so that China is convinced that territories cannot be gained by them. And secondly, I think we must take a much broader view of China's place in the world and the problems that face China. She has as much right to be in the world as anyone else. I do not agree with the line that the Americans or anyone are fighting to contain China. I think that is the wrong approach. I think that what we're really fighting for here in the long term vis-a-vis China is to establish a state of coexistence with China, just as to a certain extent a state of coexistence with Russia has now been established as a result of crises like Berlin and Cuba and so on. There is now a line which neither side will cross, and this has got to be established with China. It will take much longer because I think China is much more stubborn in this respect and is also very much more orthodox from the communist point of view.
Coming to terms with China means coming to terms with a power determined to achieve great power status. A power pledged to bring about world communist revolution. As long as these remain China's aims, avoiding conflict will, for China and the powers that surround her, be the most difficult challenge in the struggle for peace. Next week, the series, The Struggle for Peace, examines war around the world in chaos and conflict. This series is presented in conjunction with the publication of the book, The Struggle for Peace, by Leonard Beaton.
This is NET, the National Educational Television Network.